Good afternoon. As Gilles has said, my name is Andreas Veispak, and I am the head of unit responsible for space data and societal challenges and growth. It's a long and complicated name, but actually the reason for the creation of this unit which I'm now in charge of, I think represents a bit of a paradigm change in the way in which the EU is treating the Copernicus program. For the last, I would like to say years, but I think decades is probably the better word. The focus of the EU has been to set up the necessary infrastructure for Copernicus. So we have done this essentially through two main pillars. The first one is to make sure that we are able to now continue launching the satellites. There are three of them in orbit, so Sentinel 1A, 2A, and 3A. And the second part of our effort has been to create a set of Copernicus services which deal with 6 thematic areas, so from land monitoring to emergency to security to atmosphere to climate change. The realization that I think has come upon the Commission, well, not recently, but about 2 years ago or so, is that now that the program is getting to a stage where it's operational, we need to start focusing more on extracting the value from the data. Initially, the data distribution systems that we created were primarily targeted towards those same 6 core services of Copernicus. They were not really, I think, created to distribute the data to Orbi and Orbi, so be it to businesses, be it to citizens. So before I even get, I think, to the core of the presentation, I think that we're seeing quite a big shift in terms of where the EU is looking at, and this will be reflected, I think, in the space strategy, which we will adopt late this year. It will be all about what the title of this presentation is, which is essentially getting the data out as far and wide as possible in order to exploit the benefits that we can get from it. So I'm going to very briefly talk about really 3 things. The first one is going to be 2 minutes, where I'm just going to give a couple of examples. I'm very happy to see, Jeff, that you're there, because I'm going to cite the studies that you have been doing on forest management in Sweden and ice breaking in Finland to just show tangible, quantitative aspects to the use of space data, because it's not often that somebody has undertaken an exercise to systematically take a bottom-up approach to work out what the benefits are. The second part of the presentation will be to look at a little bit at the barriers to the uptake, and then I come to the role of the public sector. The key word here is enabling, because I think that everything that we will do aims to enable. Before I get to this, because from the last session there was one thing which really struck me, which was more the legal and the regulatory dimension to big data. Now, the Copernicus program is, in this sense, is quite well positioned to act as a catalyst to the uptake of and use of big data technologies. Is that if you look at the 3 main areas of concern that we have with big data traditionally, then these are questions of ownership, these are questions of privacy, and these are questions of security. Now, with Copernicus, none of these problems really exist, because the ownership of the data is clear. The European Commission essentially owns the data on behalf of the Union with a data policy that is free, full and open, and that is at the heart and core of everything we do. So the question of ownership is not really as sensitive here as it might be in other domains. It's exactly the same with security. At the end of last year, we had the unanimous confirmation of all our member states that Copernicus data does not represent something which is security sensitive, apart from certain very specific applications, primarily related to contributing missions, so not to the core sentinels. So the security problem isn't there either, and frankly, neither is the privacy problem, which means that being able to use Copernicus and the data it generates as a critical mass for the development of the data economy as a whole, we're quite well positioned, because the main problems are not there. So, benefits of space and applications. Jeff, you will recognize this slide. So the European Association of Remote Sensing Companies has completed 2, what in my view are excellent case studies to look at the societal value, especially for public authorities, of using satellite and Copernicus data. The conclusions are essentially that despite the very high level of investment that we've made in the system, if you take just the question of the issue of Sweden and of Finland, what you see is that the return can be as significant, and the estimates that we have on a global level is that basically for every euro invested, we will generate about 3.5 euros of return. So the analysis that they did bottom up on Sweden was that through just using satellites for forest management, the annual benefits amount to 21 million euros. I'm very skeptical always about figures which are too precise. So when someone tells you that the benefits of something are 15.69987 euros is probably not right. But the order of magnitude, I think, is there. The second case study that they did was to look at the ice monitoring in Finland. Now, this is the upper level of what the benefits of satellite data reach. I think the range, Jeff, if I'm correct, was from somewhere around 20 million to 116. But if you take the whole chain, from really the use of the icebreakers to the fact that you have a guarantee of food in the supermarkets, because again, as Andreas quite rightly points out, about 90% of Finland's imports come by sea. So in the winter time, when the Baltic is frozen over, it is actually quite important to have the access. So the conclusion here is that if you just take two relatively small European countries, you see that the annual return on the investment made can be quite significant, not only for the private sector or the business environment, but also for the public sector. Now, the barriers to uptake, we basically take a very classical value chain approach to this, and the value chain approach takes us from the midstream sector to the end users. We've identified three key problems that we will try to address in the years to come, which is that, as I already hinted, I think, at the start of this talk, the main problem that we have is that it's still quite difficult to access and to use Copernicus data, especially in Europe. What we see from certain of our users is that it is actually easier for them to access Copernicus data not through the core ground segments of the European Space Agency, but rather to do it through intermediaries, particularly in the US. So what we will first and foremost focus on is really improving the dissemination and the access system, and this we will do in two pillars, but I will come to this in a second. The second problem that we have is that despite the fact that we've set up the Copernicus services on the basis of thematic areas, we don't really have ecosystems or environments where all the data can meet. And what we also see is that the user groups for these data are quite specific. The involvement of the downstream private sector is still relatively limited. So the second issue that we will try to address is to stimulate activities by the downstream and the value-added sector to act as a bridge between essentially the data itself and the end users. And finally, what we see is that the awareness of the possibilities that's offered by this data is still relatively low, both in the public sector but also in the private sector. And here the issue of opportunity cost arises. Because when you're looking at big data applications and you are, well, either a talented young programmer or you're in the business of coding, the first question that you have to ask yourself is, why should I be involved in this business at all? Rather than deal with pharma or deal with health or deal with financial services or deal with something where the return is relatively more secure, is relatively more tangible. So boosting demand is essentially the third of the axis that we will look at. And now to the core of what I want to say, which is on the enabling role of the public sector. Before I get into the details, I think that there are probably 5 or 6 roles that we see for the public sector as a whole. And these roles, I mean, they will not come as a surprise to anybody, because these are the roles of the public sector in whatever domain, which is essentially to provide a sound, predictable, and let's just say planning certainty driven environment in which the economic operators can actually make use of the data. In this case here, I think that the first and the most overwhelming objective, which we are gradually fulfilling now, is to provide the data itself. I mentioned the free, full and open data policy, but given that Copernicus is a public program, given the fact that it rests on taxpayer financing, we view the data coming from Copernicus as essentially a classical public good. So making the data available and actually providing it free of charge to everybody is the first and the core role on which everything that we do rests. The second role that we see for ourselves is to facilitate the exploitation of the data. It is not easy to exploit this data. I think our archive is going to be something to the tune of 50 petabytes in about 7 years' time. So what we will look to do is to take away some of the risk which is related to the exploitation of this data. From the presentations that we've heard this morning, there are lots of good ideas out there, but there's still a lot of uncertainty tied to it. So if we can, either in the shape of becoming an anchor client or in the shape of mutualizing some of the common cost, which is basically common to all users, if we can enable the exploitation of this data and allowing economic operators to focus really on the value-added part, not on trying to find out where you can get the data and how and how you can get it into a format in which is usable, I think that we would have taken quite a big step. So that's the second point, is to really enable and facilitate the exploitation of the data. The third role for any public authority is the regulatory role that it takes, both on the market side but also on the more traditional regulatory side, relating to issues like competition, but also, as I say, security and privacy. The market regulation here is actually quite key. The reason it is quite key is that we don't see Copernicus as being the end of everything that we do, because Copernicus was not designed to be what we would call an economic tool. Copernicus was set up originally as GMES for the monitoring of environment and security. So the primary purpose was for it to be a policy tool, not to be an economic tool. So the question is, how do you turn something, the design objective of which was not primary economic, into something which can enable the development of economic value added? And there I think the role that we can play is to use the critical mass of Copernicus to ask for a basic service to be provided to the public authorities, but on top of that service leave all the commercial freedom for any business model to emerge. I will talk about this when I come to the data platforms and the data access service, but the idea being that the public sector would in this case define a minimum level of public service and then leave the economic operators free to provide whatever service they want next to it, be it data sales, be it charging for processing power along the lines of say, Amazon, or be it on the basis of providing value-added services. What we also see is that the demand for Earth observation data is still largely public sector driven. So 60 to 70% of the demand here is still from the public sector. So the demand-related support is probably the fourth pillar of what we will do, is to try to consolidate through different procurement measures that we have in place and that we're developing at the moment to provide a basic market for the economic operator. The midstream sector, this is the data access. I'm sorry if the language gets a little bit, well, I didn't want to say technical, but very, very EU specific. The integration of the existing ground segment infrastructure is something which is a very European problem. When we heard the speakers this morning, the message that came out on the European Union versus, say, the US or other large jurisdictions is that we have quite a fragmented market. But we don't just have a fragmented market because of the national competences, we also have a fragmented market because we have designed Copernicus in a way which is quite equitable towards everybody. So if you look at the data dissemination structures that we have in place, we have the core ground segment of the European Space Agency, we have the core ground segment of EUMETSAT, we have negotiations ongoing with 13 member states to create collaborative ground segments to enhance the use and the dissemination of these data nationally. We have the 6 Copernicus services which also have their own dissemination facilities. So in short, we have a highly distributed infrastructure, and what we are going to try to do is to essentially consolidate these into a single system so that the level of fragmentation is not a barrier to essentially exploiting the big data paradigm, let's say that. The next two bullet points, so the improving of the conventional data dissemination and the platform-based data access service, are the two pillars of what we will try to achieve through improving the data dissemination. The public sector will always rely on its own means to make sure that good care is taken of the data and that users can access the data directly. So we will try to beef up the dissemination system that we have through ESA and EUMETSAT, which is in place already. Now, the newer idea is to essentially set up a series of parallel access services which would allow essentially co-locating the processing power with the data, try to, through the technical specifications that we will develop before the end of this year, improve the interoperability of both the data and the cloud environment, but also make sure that this environment is open, as I said earlier, to whatever other business model. I'll stop a little bit on the platform service because I think it will be quite central to what we do. Now, the EU is not looking to own and operate infrastructures. What the EU is going to look to do is to buy a series of parallel services through which we would set a minimum public service requirement. And that minimum public service requirement is likely to include the taking on of all the data and information from Copernicus. It is likely to include very general and almost obvious policy aspects for us, such as equitable access throughout the single market. But it will also involve other questions, such as the ability to attract other types of data, be this from the European Space Agency missions, be this from international missions, such as, say, Landsat 8 in the US, be it data which might have nothing to do with Earth observation in the first place, plus also the ability to engage with user communities and to integrate the member states' infrastructures into the platform-based service. The idea is that by having a mid to a long-term data access contract, we would provide the security of investment and take away some of the risk from the private sector by becoming the anchor client for these services. And once, obviously, we would not just do it out of goodwill. We would buy the aforementioned service with the defined functionalities for that money. But the key element of what we would try to do, and this comes back to using Copernicus as the critical mass, is to say that after furnishing this basic level of service, the commercial operators are actually free to do what on earth they want. So if they want to sell the data, they can sell the data on a commercial basis. If they want to sell processing power, they can do so. If they want to develop whatever business model they want, this is perfectly okay with us as long as they meet the minimum service requirements that we have. The idea being that you use the core of a non-economic program simply due to the volume to attract all types of other data around it, and then you just leave it open and free. That essentially, I think, is going to be the center of the approach that we will take. Sorry, I will speed up. I know I might take too long. The joint user uptake strategy with the Copernicus services essentially relates to making the service information that currently emerges out of the system more useful as it is, because the uptake of the data by Copernicus services is something which is very, very clearly designed to fulfill a public sector role. What we would like to do is to push a little bit the service information out further, and in parallel to this, we will obviously pay for a series of or what we would call technical assistance services to make sure that those who don't necessarily have too much experience with Earth observation data are actually able to use it. On the intermediate users, I promise you I will be quick. We come back to the predictability and the planning certainty. This is what my first bullet point is essentially about, and this comes back to a little bit to the role of the public authorities as a market regulator. We don't really at the moment provide that planning certainty to the full extent because there is a public service attached to Copernicus. There are quite a few commercial companies who do not know whether they can invest in a product or not because they are not sure whether it will not be offered by the public sector in a year or two. So the idea is that we will set a very clear perimeter around what the public service obligation that we have through the services is, to give a very clear message to the private sector. Anything beyond that perimeter is basically an economic concern for the downstream sector. The Copernicus startup program is essentially going to try to deal with exactly the opportunity costs that I mentioned earlier, and this will involve basically all the stages of a company's development, from idea generation, be it through app camps or be it through competitions, business development, incubation, but also in the growth phase. The internationalization of EO SMEs is an effort on our side to complement the budget that we have available through Copernicus by complementing it with other EU programs. COSME is a program for small and medium-sized enterprises, which puts quite a lot of focus on the export capacity and internationalization of EU enterprises. So we're going to have a series of dedicated calls devoted essentially only to the use of Copernicus and Earth observation data. Similarly for Horizon 2020 and research, and on the GeoICT and skills, that is something where we intend to set up a network of universities, but also use the European Institute of Technology and the knowledge and innovation communities, which is what KIC stands for, to essentially boost the supply of skills. And then finally, on the public user side, I'm not going to go very deeply into this. We will set up a mechanism by which we are able to support the member states in the creation of public demand for services based on space data, but we will also increasingly use the opportunity provided to us by the new Public Procurement Directive, which is to start procuring cross-border. So this is several regions or several member states from across the EU buying the same service together. Obviously, given that Copernicus was set up to be a program primarily to meet the EU's policy objectives, we're going to try to strengthen a little bit the use of this data within our own house, and then the cross-sectoral dimension essentially to improve productivity and the communication and outreach should be pretty self-explanatory. On this slide I will not stop because it just summarizes in a graphical way what we will try to do from the role of the Commission at the start through the different tools that we have until the end users themselves. And I'm hoping that is it.